as Bible students, we're not arbitrary watchers of events in the world. We do so, don't we, through the lens of Scripture. It's the scriptural lens that provides us with the answers for the things that we see in the world at the moment and throughout history. Some of the things that have been taking place, particularly in this last week or so. But for us to really appreciate the significance of headlines such as this, we need to open our Bibles, which some of you may have with you this morning, some of you may not have, but don't worry. Either way, I'll read some scriptures to us as we go through our brief study this morning to really reflect on the things that are happening in the world. So this headline says, Middle East Quartet convenes in effort to stop West Bank annexation plans. So that headline's from the 22nd of May. So literally on Friday it was, that Russia has said, we want to get a group together, the Middle East Quartet, so that would be the United Nations, the European Union, Russia, and the United States, to get together to discuss what are Israel doing in their West Bank annexation plans. Now, for us to really appreciate these things, we ought to open our Bibles, and I'm going to do so, to Revelation 16. Now, in Revelation 16, it's a remarkable prophecy, and it brings us, verse 16, to the battle of Armageddon. So we're told that the Lord God Almighty gathered the nations together to a battle which in the Hebrew tongue is called Armageddon. So we know that Armageddon is the final battle, as it were. It's known throughout the world, isn't it? The word Armageddon, all the connotations that come with it. But it's a biblical term, and it's a term that tells us of the end of the age as we currently know it. So we're interested, aren't we, in what the key historical events or signs of the times are that we should look to when we're to lead up to this great event. Because Armageddon, verse 16 of Revelation 16, hasn't yet happened. So we go back to verse 12, which is the beginning of this particular period, where we read that the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water dried up. Now, Bible students have known for hundreds of years what this symbol is. The river Euphrates was the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that took over Constantinople and booted the Christians out of Constantinople, and the Turks, the Muslims, created an empire, the Byzantine Empire, that was a major empire. The Ottoman Empire, as it was there for hundreds of years until it was made to dry up. And the reason the Euphrates is a good symbol is because the river Euphrates begins in Turkey, and so as the river dries up, it goes back to Turkey. So the Ottoman Empire pretty much completely has dried up. Turkey still exists, but all the same, there's no empire there, is there? That happened at the beginning of the last century in the events around the First World War. But we're then told in verse 13 that we should look for 3 unclean spirits like frogs that would come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. So you've got 3 key players, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, and out of their mouths would come these unclean spirits like frogs. We're told in verse 14, they're the spirits of devils, working miracles to go forth to the kings of the earth and the whole world to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty, the battle of Armageddon. So we're told in our time to look out for 3 unclean spirits like frogs that would come out of the mouth of 3 players, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Well, those players, we don't have time to really research the identity of those players now. We're just going to accept it that the dragon speaks to us of the eastern side of Europe, which was Constantinople when Rome split in 2. And of course, what happened as the Turks came into Constantinople, so the dragon power moved up to Moscow, to Russia. And so the dragon there you see on the eastern side sitting in Russia. Then you've got the beast. Well, the beast we know from Daniel and from the book of Revelation is the European powers. So the beast is Europe, and the false prophet, well, that's easy. The false prophet we understand, don't we, to be the papacy, the Pope, the Vatican. So we're interested in the frog-like spirits coming out of the mouth of these three key players. The beast, Europe. The dragon, Russia. And the false prophet, the Vatican. Now, we need to begin, though, by asking ourselves, as we always do as Bible students, well, where do we come across frogs in Scripture? And if I ask this question to you now, all of you, I'm sure, would be calling out to me that we come across frogs, of course, in the book of Exodus. So though we have these three unclean spirits like frogs in Revelation, we want to go back to Exodus to see what these frogs perhaps represent. So will you come back, if you've got a Bible, to Exodus, perhaps keep a marker in Revelation, but come back to Exodus chapter 8, where we read... We read in Exodus chapter 8 of the frogs, the plague of the frogs that is brought upon Egypt. And we learn that these frogs go everywhere. So in Exodus chapter 8, don't forget that this is the only place in Scripture that we read of frogs outside of the book of Revelation, when they're given to us as a symbol. So we only know of the frogs in Egypt. So what do we know about this plague? Well, verse 3 of Exodus 8. The river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thy house, into thy bedchamber, on thy bed, in the house of thy servants, on thy people, in thy ovens, in thy kneading troughs. The frogs shall come upon you and upon your people, upon all your servants. They're going to go everywhere, and they're going to affect everyone. So it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whether you're from the political elite or you're a servant, the frogs are going to affect you. It doesn't matter if you've got a mansion or a tent. The frogs are going to get into it, and they're going to affect you. So the frogs go everywhere. Now, we then read in verse 11 that after the frogs, after the Pharaoh says to Moses, "Oh, please get rid of the frogs," that Moses prays to the Lord, and we read verse 11 that the frogs are going to depart from you, from your houses, from your servants, from your people. They'll remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to the Lord because of the frogs which he'd brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out of the houses, out of the villages, out of the fields. Now look at this, verse 14. They gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. Now, do you notice that? They gathered them together upon heaps. What did we read? I've still got a marker in Revelation 16 about Armageddon. We read, didn't we, in Revelation 16, verse 16, that God gathered them together into a place which in the Hebrew tongue is called Armageddon. Now, Armageddon, you know, means a heap of sheaves in a valley of threshing. So how are these frogs gathered together? Exodus 8, verse 14, they gathered them together upon heaps. In the Hebrew, it's actually heaps, heaps. There's so many. As these frogs now die out, they're gathered together on heaps, heaps. And note this last detail, the land stank. It was stinking. Now, that's all we're told in the Bible about the frogs. And it's interesting. We note it. But we then say, well, what historically can we learn about the frogs? Many of you will know that John Thomas, a Christadelphian writing in the 1840s, suggested, as did others before him, by the way, that the frogs were the symbol of the French democracy. And he goes on to explain that the symbol of three frogs, you can see there perhaps on the pictures on the screen, the three frogs are the ancient symbol from France. So that key symbol of three frog-like spirits in the book of Revelation should get us looking at France. And as Brother Thomas wrote, the symbol of the French democracy. Now let's have a look at that. This photograph is from Reims, which is a cathedral and palace, the Palace de Thau in northern France. We've been there as a family on a couple of occasions to have a look. And in that cathedral, which is very, very famous, it's an ancient cathedral, it was the place where Clovis, the first king of the Franks, was baptized. And he moved from being someone that was a Unitarian and a barbarian to all intents and purposes, but he accepted the doctrine of the Trinity. Incorrectly so, of course. And in the Palace de Thau hangs this banner which shows the battles of Clovis as he became the first king of France. And many of you will not be able to see, but if you can look really carefully, you can see on the screen that the standard, the flag that Clovis used in that battle is the symbol of three frogs. So that's key to us understanding the symbol in Revelation. Let's keep going to see that Clovis was historically considered the first king of the Franks. So here's the family tree of the Merovingian kings, of which you can see at the top that Clovis was the first. And so history tells us the heraldic symbol of the Frankish Merovingian dynasty of kings was three frogs. In the 6th century, Clovis united the Frankish tribes under one ruler. He was the first royal house to rule the whole of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. The history of France starts with Clovis. So this man is of great significance because his symbol, the three frogs, is key to us understanding the book of Revelation. So we can see just more history there to tell us that Clovis was the first king of the Franks. Now, moving to more modern times, I mean, it's not modern, we're still talking several hundred years ago. You know, don't you, at the end of the 1700s, in 1789, in the heart of Europe in France, there was a great rebellion where the people rose up against the aristocracy and said, we're fed up with this. We want common men to be able to be rulers. And they created a banner, if you like, under which the peasants and the people rose up, of which was liberty, equality, fraternity. And we would suggest that those three things are key when we look at the history of France as what we see today in the frog-like spirits. Now, I don't think many of you will know who it is on the screen there. There's a picture there of a man with a beard. It's not me. He's a lot older than me. That man is Rene Kisan. Now, Rene Kisan was a Jew living in France at the beginning of the last century. He fought in the First World War, and he was badly injured in that war, so much so that he was unable to fight again. But what Rene Kisan did, he had a brilliant mind, of course, as so many Jews do. He used all his energy to try to stop any sort of war like he'd seen in the First World War, the Great War, happening again. And so he was instrumental in working as a diplomat for France to the League of Nations. And he was asked then to write a key document. That document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here's Rene Kisan's legacy website. We're told that he was born in 1887 in France. He died in 1976 in Paris. His role was the president of the European Court for Human Rights. His field was in human rights. He's considered the father of the Declaration of Human Rights. So here's this Jew raised up for a purpose to create these human rights. Why is this of interest to us? Because when you look at the history regarding Rene Kisan with these human rights, we see that rather remarkably, everything that he created for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted from the entire contents of the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So what came out of the French Revolution, the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was a key document underpinning Western societies across the world, even today, Rene Kisan used that document, and he used it to, the entire contents of it, we're told there, to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, you still may ask, why does this matter at the moment? Well, if you look on the United Nations website, what you'll see is that the phrase human rights, they tell you, and the idea of international human rights law, which the United Nations seeks to uphold, is based entirely on, that article tells us, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So let's just reflect and consider what we've just seen. When we read of the frog-like spirits in Revelation, we look at our Bibles and we see that the book of Exodus tells us what these frogs will do. They'll go everywhere, to everyone. Everyone will be affected. But eventually, we're told in the book of Exodus, they will die out, they'll be destroyed, and they'll be gathered together on heaps. When we look at history to look at the frog-like spirits, our minds are very quickly drawn to France. In fact, we see that the symbol of three frogs is key to the history of France. And in the book of Revelation, we read of a great earthquake, which is about the French Revolution, because it was such a major event in affecting world history. It changed the course of events. One historian said, it's such a major event, we're yet to see the full consequences of it. That's remarkable, isn't it? Given that it was over 200 years ago. So this great earthquake of the French Revolution produces the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the three-pronged cry, liberty, equality, fraternity, which is used in the last century by a French Jew to draw up the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which is used to underpin international human rights law. So here we are, we're nearly there. Therefore, when me and you see nations and individuals calling out people for not obeying international law or international human rights law, in effect, what they are doing is allowing the frog-like spirits, the spirits of liberty, equality, fraternity, the spirit of France that's come into and affected international law. When they're speaking those things, it is the frog-like spirits which are coming out of their mouth. So, over 2 years ago now, the United Nations passed this resolution. It was in December 2016, the last month that Barack Obama was in the White House. And where previously he and all other American presidents did not pass resolutions that would condemn Israel, on this occasion, Barack Obama said, I'm not going to vote. I'm going to abstain from voting. And in so doing, on the 23rd of December 2016, a key UN resolution was passed. Resolution 2334. There it is on the screen. And it tells Israel, you have to take your borders back to what they were in 1967. Before the 6-Day War, when you took all this additional land, you've got to give it back to the Palestinians. You've got to give your borders back to Jordan, to Syria, to Egypt, and particularly to the Palestinians. So that was on the 23rd of December 2016. Now in January 2017, it all goes wrong for the international community, because Obama, who we see there on the screen, or rather we see the headline, says that he chose not to vote on that resolution. In January 2017, Obama left office. And this headline is from March the 18th this year, so about 2 months ago. The construction rate in Israel settlements up 25% since Trump took office in January 2017. So Obama agrees with the international community. Israel, you're not allowed to build on the West Bank any longer. You can't build there. And then Obama finishes and Donald Trump comes into office, and immediately the settlements begin to grow again exponentially. 25% growth since Trump took office, we're told in a headline just a couple of months ago. Israeli settlements in West Bank expanding rapidly in Donald Trump era. And of course, on the 28th of January this year, Trump released his long-awaited Middle East peace plan, which we can see there in the BBC article says he proposed an independent Palestinian state and the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over West Bank settlements. So the international community is furious with Donald Trump because of his stance towards Israel. And you and I may look on and we may see Donald Trump and a lot of his policies we would very firmly disagree with. And yet we can see that the angels have put him there for a purpose, not least to allow the West Bank settlements to grow in Israel. So the United Nations regrets the new US position on the legality of Israeli settlements. This tweet was actually in November last year. But do you see that the tweet from the United Nations says, we continue to follow the long-standing position of the UN that the Israeli settlements are a breach of international law. So what is he saying? In saying that these settlements are a breach of international law, we now know where that international law is from. It's from the frog-like spirits. So he might as well tweet that the UN position on the Israeli settlements is a breach of the frog-like spirits. That is what is coming out of his mouth. And yet, 25th of February 2020, Netanyahu pledges to build new settler homes ahead of the elections. We know, don't we, that the Israeli elections this year and last year were a nightmare, that they had to keep going back and forth because they couldn't form a government. There weren't enough votes on either side. And yet we've seen just in the last month that Netanyahu has retained his power position in Israel, despite the fact there's a court case against him that's come out this week, and he's going to have to go to court, but he still remains the PM of Israel. And we know that his policy is to keep building. Now, Brother Thomas, that Christadelphian writing in the 1800s, in the 1860s, writing a book called Eureka, said this: it may be remarked here that there will have been a considerable gathering of Israelites on the mountains of Israel before the invasion of the country by Gog. Now we know that Gog is the dragon of Revelation 16. It's Russia. So before Russia invades Israel, he says there will have been a considerable gathering of Israelites on the mountains. What a remarkable statement. Where's he got it from? Well, from the prophecy of Ezekiel. If you've got a Bible open, will you come back to Ezekiel 36? Ezekiel 36, we read about the mountains of Israel. Now we know that the mountains of Israel are the West Bank. The mountains are the Judean hills, the Sumerian hills that stretch from south to north, north to south, just to the west of the River Jordan. In fact, they were called the West Bank by Jordan, who was put in control of the territory by the British. And of course, they just, because the West Bank, it was west of the River Jordan. And that territory has remained called by that name. But when we read the mountains of Israel in the Bible, we're reading about the West Bank. And what do we read in Ezekiel 36, verse 8? I put it there on the screen. You, O mountains of Israel, the West Bank. God says, verse 10, I will multiply on you all the house of Israel, even all of it. The cities will be inhabited, the wastes will be builded. I will multiply on you man and beast. They will increase and bring fruit. I will settle you. Isn't this remarkable? That we have seen a population explosion on the West Bank. Brother Thomas said that there will have been a considerable gathering of Israelites on the mountains of Israel before Gog comes. Not even he could possibly have imagined there would be over 500,000 Jewish settlers on the West Bank. And of course, they're in what we call the settlements. What do we read? I will settle you on the mountains of Israel. So why does this matter? Because the United Nations, the European Union, Russia, the Vatican are not happy about what Israel are doing. So this headline is from the 24th of April. The UN and the European Union warn Israel against West Bank annexation. Palestinians stiffen the battle against annexation at the UN Security Council. So the Jerusalem Post reported this at the beginning of this month, on May the 8th. The Palestinians are seeking a wide and powerful front in the United Nations to prevent Israel from annexing parts of the West Bank. They want to stop them building. The European Union is to rally against Israel's West Bank annexation proposal. The European Union to launch a diplomatic push, this is the 16th of May now, against Israeli West Bank annexation. Israel prepares for West Bank annexation despite the pandemic spread. That article, we're now in the last week. That was at the beginning of last week. Israel is preparing for this West Bank annexation. The Times of Israel reported just on Saturday, Russia, the United Nations, and the Vatican condemn the unilateral Israeli annexation plan. Notice the players. Russia, the dragon. The UN, that's speaking of the kings of the earth and the whole world. And the Vatican, that is, of course, the false prophet. Russia warns Israel against expansionist actions. What is it that they say? Why do they say it's not okay? Let's just read a little of this article from this week. The annexation would make impossible the territorial continuity of the West Bank of the River Jordan, which is an essential condition for the viability of a future Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders. Such expansionist actions by Israel could provoke a dangerous cycle of violence in the Palestinian territories, as well as destabilize the situation in the Middle East region as a whole. So they're not happy, are they? Russia's stance on Israeli settlements in West Bank remains unchanged. Notice the small print there on the screen. Earlier in the day, this is just last week, US Secretary of State Michael Pompeo said Washington no longer viewed Israeli settlements in the area as illegal and in breach of the international law. So the US is saying we've got no problem with it. But Russia, the Vatican, the European Union, the United Nations, they're furious and they're calling Israel out under international law. Israeli annexation, the Jerusalem Post reports last Thursday, may lead to escalation in the region. The UN Middle East envoy warns against unilateral action on all sides, saying you can't do it. This is the UN envoy to the Middle East, just last week speaking to the United Nations. The Vatican opposes the Israeli annexation plan. So do you remember our key players that we started with in Revelation 16? The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. We're interested as Bible students in what the dragon, Russia, in what the false prophet, the Vatican, in what the beast, the Europe, have got to say about international law, because the frog-like spirits will come out of their mouth. They're not happy about Israel. So the Vatican said this on Wednesday last week. The Holy See reiterates that respect for international law and the relevant United States resolutions is an indispensable element for the two people to live side by side in two states within the borders internationally recognized before 1967. So do you see that coming out of the Vatican last week is the call for Israel to respect international law? That is the frog-like spirits coming out of their mouth last week. What about Europe? European Union members at the UN Security Council. Israeli annexation would violate international law. So out of the mouth of Europe in the UN last week, they're calling Israel out for violating international law. That is, out of their mouth coming the frog-like spirits. Netanyahu trial. The Israeli Prime Minister faces a Jerusalem court. That's the headline from yesterday. What does the world think about it? Well, what does the trial mean? The BBC goes on to say. And they say, although it's for Netanyahu, it's a nightmare to have this trial, it's not going to stop them annexing the West Bank territory and continuing to build in the West Bank. And so as we pull our thoughts together, we remember again what Brother Thomas wrote in 1848 in his book Elpis Israel. He says, look out for Russia, the dragon power. It's a notable sign of the times when they start moving. The Russian autocracy in its plenitude and on the verge of its dissolution is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing where? On the mountains of Israel. So we know, don't we, from Ezekiel 38, that Russia will come with confederate nations. Those confederate nations will be European powers. The papacy will be in support. And they will come and they'll drop down onto the mountains of Israel. Just turn finally with me to Ezekiel 39. You remember, don't you, that we began with the frogs of Egypt. Those frog-like spirits that went everywhere. And we know from Revelation 16 that language is used. He gathered them together to the battle of Armageddon. So the frogs, which are coming out of the mouth as we speak, of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, will be used to get the whole kings of the earth together. We're seeing the international community call Israel out for building on the West Bank, on the mountains of Israel. And in Ezekiel 39, we read about our role, that we as the saints will go out and will destroy this great army, the Gogian host. And where will we destroy them? Ezekiel 39, we read in verse 2, talking of Gog, I'll turn thee back and leave but the sixth part of thee, will cause thee to come up from the north parts. I'll bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. I'll smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and I cause thine arrows to fall out of thy right hand. Thou wilt fall on the mountains of Israel, and all thy bands, all the armies with you. The people that are with you I'll give into the ravenous birds of every sort, the beasts of the field to be devoured. They're going to be destroyed. Where? On the mountains of Israel. And what do you notice in verse 11? That when they gather the bodies up, we're told that a valley is used, the valley of Haman Gog, to bury the dead. And in the middle of verse 11, we're told it will stop the noses of the passengers. Do you remember what we saw with the frogs? That they gathered them together upon heaps and the land stank. And so, as the Gogian Confederacy is destroyed, so the land will stink. And so, brothers and sisters and friends, these things speak to us of the most remarkable signs of the times. When we see this last week, the international community, particularly Europe, the Vatican and Russia, calling Israel out because of their plans on the West Bank, we see that out of the mouth of these three players is coming the frog-like spirits, exactly as we would expect, to gather the kings of the earth and the whole world to bring them to the battle of Armageddon. And that battle will take place on the very place that these nations are calling Israel out for building on, just as God told us they would do in Ezekiel 36 as a great sign of the times for us today.